My son charged me $250,000 to live in his basement after I broke. The same basement where I taught him to tie his shoes. 47 years building a $12 million empire, 62 years old. And my own blood made me pay $250,000 annually to sleep on a fold-out couch 8 feet underground while he lived in the house above me. But here's what destroyed me. When my 8-year-old granddaughter pressed her face against the window, crying as I carried my life's belongings down those basement stairs, my son told her, "Grandpa is learning about consequences. In chess, you sacrifice your queen to checkmate the king. I sacrificed my entire empire to expose the monster I'd raised, because this story has more devastating twists than a tornado, and every single one is backed by federal evidence that will put him in prison for 25 years. If you've ever built something from zero only to watch family try to destroy it, drop a comment telling me where you started. Hit subscribe if you want to see how a broken old man can systematically dismantle a predator using nothing but patience and the law." What my son didn't know was that for 18 months, while he thought he was hunting me, I'd been hunting him. My name is Chuck Lawson. For 47 years, I built Lawson Construction Group from nothing. Started as a carpenter's apprentice in 1976, ended as CEO of a $12 million operation with 43 employees and projects across 3 states. I thought I was leaving a legacy for my family. I was wrong. My son Bradley, Brad to his friends, which apparently didn't include me anymore, made his position clear during our phone call on March 15th, 2023. The recession had hit construction hard. Banks were calling loans. Clients weren't paying invoices. The company that took me nearly 5 decades to build was hemorrhaging money faster than I could plug the holes. "Dad, you need help," Brad said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "Real help. Professional management." Professional management, as if 47 years in the industry meant nothing. The house at 1847 Oak Street, the house where Brad learned to ride a bike, where we celebrated his graduation, where his mother took her last breath, was already in foreclosure proceedings. The bank wanted $680,000 and I didn't have. Everything was collapsing. "I've been talking to my lawyer," Brad continued. "We think the best option is for you to move in with us, just temporarily until you get back on your feet." Relief flooded through me. My son stepping up when his father needed him most. Maybe I'd raised him right after all. "The basement apartment is perfect for you. Private entrance, bathroom, kitchenette. You'll have your independence. The basement, not the guest room, not the main house. The basement." "Of course, we'd need to formalize the arrangement," Brad said. "Market rate for a furnished basement apartment in this area runs about $250,000 annually. But since you're family, I'm willing to work with you." The phone felt heavy in my hand. "$250,000? Brad, I'm your father." "Dad, this is business. You taught me to keep business and family separate, remember?" I did remember. I'd taught him that lesson when he was 12 and wanted to skip his chores because we're rich. I'd made him earn every dollar of his allowance. I thought I was teaching him the value of work. Instead, I'd apparently taught him to see family as a profit center. "I'll need first year's rent up front," Brad continued. "Consider it a security deposit. And Dad, this offer expires in 48 hours. I've got other people interested in the space." But he didn't know what I'd been planning while my empire crumbled around me. Let me take you back to how this all started. Because the devil, as they say, is in the details. Lawson Construction Group wasn't just a company. It was my life's work. I started in 1976 with a pickup truck, a toolbox, and a dream to build something lasting. By 2020, we were pulling in $12 million annually. Strip malls, office complexes, residential developments. If it needed building in 3 states, we built it. Brad joined the company straight out of college in 2011 with a business degree and big ideas. I made him start at the bottom, literally, digging foundations, mixing concrete, learning the trade from the ground up. He hated every minute of it. "This isn't what I went to school for, Dad," he'd complain. "I should be in management, not manual labor." But I believed, foolishly it turns out, that understanding the work made better leaders. My father had taught me the same way. starting me as an apprentice despite owning his own small operation. By 2018, Brad had worked his way up to project manager. Good with clients, decent with scheduling, terrible with workers. He treated the crew like servants instead of craftsmen. I should have seen the warning signs then. The first crack in our relationship appeared during Thanksgiving 2019. We were discussing the company's growth, and Brad casually mentioned his inheritance timeline. When you retire, Dad, I'm thinking we restructure everything, modernize the operation, maybe bring in some real business talent. Real business talent. As if the business that fed his family for 3 decades had been built by amateurs. I'm not retiring anytime soon, I told him. And when I do, the transition will be gradual. He didn't like that answer. I could see it in his eyes. That flash of entitlement. That assumption that my life's work was somehow his birthright. The 2008 recession had been bad, but 2022 was worse. Supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, inflation eating into margins. We'd survived downturns before by being lean and adaptable, but this was different. Bigger clients were defaulting, banks were tightening credit, projects were stalling. By January 2023, I was facing the hardest decision of my career: lay off longtime employees or liquidate everything. I chose liquidation. Better to shut down with dignity than to destroy the lives of people who'd trusted me with their livelihoods. Brad disagreed, loudly. Dad, you're being emotional. Business is business. Cut the dead weight and preserve the core operation. Dead weight. He was talking about Jimmy Martinez, who'd been with us for 18 years. About Sarah Chen, our best project coordinator. About people who'd helped build this company brick by brick. That's when I realized my son and I had fundamentally different values about what business meant. For me, it was about building something worthwhile while taking care of people. For Brad, it was about extraction, getting as much as possible while giving as little as necessary. The house foreclosure was the final blow. I'd used it as collateral for a last-ditch loan to keep the company afloat. When that failed, everything came crashing down. I found myself at 62 years old with no business, no house, and apparently no son who cared about anything beyond his own financial interests. The basement offer shouldn't have surprised me. I'd seen the signs for years, the way Brad talked about maximizing family assets. His frequent questions about my will, my trust arrangements, my retirement planning. He'd been treating me like a balance sheet for years. But what Brad didn't know, what nobody knew, was that while he was calculating how to profit from my misfortune, I'd been making some calculations of my own. 3 years earlier, I'd quietly established a trust arrangement that put certain assets beyond the reach of creditors or opportunistic family members. Not because I was planning to fail, but because I'd learned the hard way that business success could disappear overnight. As I sat in my empty house on that final night, surrounded by cardboard boxes and legal documents, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to take Brad's deal, live in his basement, pay his extortionate rent. And while I was down there, I was going to find out exactly who my son had become. Then my son made an offer I'll never forget. The rental agreement Brad presented wasn't just insulting. It was comprehensive in its cruelty. 8 pages of legal text for a basement apartment. 8 by 12 feet of finished space with concrete walls, 1 window, and the constant hum of the furnace. The kitchenette was a hot plate and a mini fridge. The bathroom had a shower that barely qualified as functional. Market rate analysis is attached, Brad said, sliding the papers across his kitchen table while his wife Jennifer avoided eye contact. Comparable properties in this zip code adjusted for square footage and amenities. Amenities. He'd actually listed proximity to laundry facilities and shared driveway access as amenities. The most galling part was Section 7. Tenant agrees that this arrangement is temporary and contingent upon good behavior and prompt payment. Landlord reserves the right to terminate with 30 days' notice. Good behavior. Like I was a child being grounded. Brad, this is in vain, I said, keeping my voice level despite the fury building in my chest. I'm your father, not some random tenant. Dad, I have to protect my family's interests. You understand business. This is just business. Business. The word he used to justify everything. I signed it anyway. What choice did I have? The alternative was the street. And at 62 with no income, my options were limited. Moving day was March 22nd. Everything I owned fit in the back of a pickup truck. The same model I'd started with in 1976. The irony wasn't lost on me. My granddaughter Sophie, 8 years old, with her mother's blonde hair and my stubborn chin, watched from the front window as I carried boxes down the exterior stairs to the basement entrance. She pressed her little hand against the glass, and I could see tears streaming down her face. That image, my granddaughter crying while I was relegated to the basement like some shameful secret, crystallized everything wrong with this arrangement. But I smiled and waved at her anyway, because whatever game Brad was playing, Sophie was innocent. The first month was the hardest. Not physically. I'd lived in worse conditions as a young man, but psychologically. Hearing footsteps above me, listening to family dinners through the ceiling, being excluded from birthday parties and weekend barbecues. Brad would text me about rent status instead of calling. Jennifer would avoid me entirely when our paths crossed in the driveway. And Sophie, sweet Sophie, was told she couldn't visit Grandpa's apartment because it was adults only. The low point came when Brad invited neighbors over for Easter dinner. I could hear the laughter, the clinking glasses, the conversation flowing above my head. When someone asked about me, Brad said, "Dad's taking some time to himself. You know how it is. Taking time to myself. In a basement. Paying $250,000 a year for the privilege." That night, lying on the fold-out couch that served as my bed, I almost broke. Almost called my lawyer, Elena Rodriguez, to discuss options for fighting the rental agreement. Almost gave up the long game I'd been planning. But then I remembered something my father told me when I was Brad's age. "Son, when someone shows you who they really are, believe them. But when they think you're beaten, that's when you learn who you really are." I wasn't beaten, I was gathering intelligence. Every conversation I had with Brad, I recorded on my phone. Legal in our state as long as one party consents. And I always consented to my own conversations. Every demand for money, every patronizing lecture about my situation, every casual cruelty, documented. Because while Brad thought he was extracting maximum profit from a desperate old man, I was building a case that would destroy him. The rental agreement he'd been so proud of would become Exhibit A in proceedings he never saw coming. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of his betrayal. I signed it, but I also made a phone call that would change everything. The call was to Elena Rodriguez, the trust attorney who'd helped me structure my affairs 3 years earlier. Elena specialized in family wealth protection. Ironic, given that I now needed protection from my own family. "Chuck, I've been worried about you," she said when I reached her from my basement phone. "I heard about the company. Are you all right?" I wasn't all right, but I wasn't calling for sympathy. "Elena, I need you to review something. The trust we established for Sophie. Has anyone tried to access it recently?" Silence on the other end. The kind of silence that precedes bad news. "Chuck, we need to meet in person. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Just tell me, has Brad done something?" "Tomorrow, Chuck, 2 o'clock. And bring identification. I may need to verify some signatures." The next day, sitting across from Elena in her downtown office, I learned the full extent of my son's betrayal. "Someone submitted amendment papers to the trust 3 months ago," Elena said, sliding a folder across her mahogany desk. "Papers that would transfer trustee authority from you to Bradley, effective immediately. 3 months ago, right around the time my business was failing and Brad started asking pointed questions about my estate planning, I opened the folder and saw my signature on documents I'd never signed. Except it wasn't really my signature. Close, but not perfect. The C in Chuck was too rounded. The final and in Lawson too straight. "This is forged," I said. "I thought so too. That's why I didn't process the amendment. But Chuck, there's more." She pulled out bank statements from Sophie's trust account. $2.8 million that I'd accumulated from my granddaughter's future, college, graduate school, maybe a house down payment when she turned 25. The statements showed 15 wire transfers over the past 2 months, all to an account in the Cayman Islands. 1.2 million gone. The transfers were initiated with the forged trustee documentation, Elena explained. Whoever did this knew enough about trust law to make it look legitimate. They even filed backup paperwork with false notarization. I stared at the numbers, feeling something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Not rage, that would come later. This was clarity, the kind of surgical focus I'd learned in 47 years of business. Elena, I want you to freeze the account immediately. Everything that's left. Already done. I initiated a hold as soon as I spotted the irregularities. But Chuck, there's something else you need to know. She turned her computer monitor toward me, showing a corporate filing database. Bradley established an LLC 2 weeks ago. Lawson Family Holdings. Guess what assets he transferred into it? My heart sank as I read the filing. Lawson Family Holdings now held the deed to Brad's house, the house where I was paying $250 annually to live in the basement. The house that, according to these documents, was purchased with funds from Sophie's trust. My son had stolen my granddaughter's college money to buy his house, then charged me rent to live in the basement of a house purchased with stolen money. The breathtaking audacity of it should have been impressive if it wasn't so criminal. Elena, I need you to document everything. Every forged signature, every illegal transfer, every fraudulent filing. Can you do that? Already started. Chuck, this isn't just theft. This is federal wire fraud, money laundering, and elder financial abuse. Bradley could be looking at 20 years in prison. 20 years. Sophie would be 28 when he got out, assuming he served the full sentence. But I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in justice and protection. Because if Brad was capable of this level of deception and theft, what else might he be planning? There's one more thing, Elena said quietly. I ran a background check on Bradley's financial activities. He's been meeting with estate planning attorneys. Different firm, not anyone I know. And according to my contact at the courthouse, he's been asking questions about involuntary conservatorship proceedings. Involuntary conservatorship, legal guardianship for adults deemed mentally incompetent. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The basement rental wasn't just about money, it was about establishing a narrative. Elderly father, failed businessman, living in dependent circumstances, paying irrational amounts for substandard housing. Perfect evidence for a competency challenge. Brad wasn't just stealing from Sophie's trust. He was positioning himself to take control of everything I had left, including my personal autonomy. Elena, how long would it take to prepare a complete forensic accounting of Brad's activities? Everything, the trust theft, the LLC formation, the property transfers, all of it? 2 weeks, maybe 3 with my forensic accountant, James Murphy. But Chuck, if you're planning what I think you're planning, you need to be careful. If Bradley suspects you're building a case against him, she didn't need to finish the sentence. A man desperate enough to forge documents and steal from his own daughter was capable of anything. But Elena found something that changed everything. James Murphy looked like an accountant from Central Casting. Wire-rimmed glasses, pocket protector, the kind of methodical precision that made criminals nervous. But beneath that mild exterior was a forensic bloodhound who'd helped the FBI unravel some of the most complex financial crimes in the district. Elena had brought him in quietly, paying his fees from my emergency cash reserves. For 3 weeks, James worked his way through Brad's financial history like an archaeologist excavating a crime scene. What he found was worse than theft. It was a systematic pattern of exploitation that stretched back 18 months. Your son is more sophisticated than we initially thought, James said, spreading documents across Elena's conference table. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was planned financial abuse with multiple layers of cover. The timeline was chilling in its premeditation. 18 months ago, long before my business troubles began, Brad had started positioning himself for what he apparently saw as an inevitable inheritance. He'd opened 3 separate LLC entities, Lawson Family Holdings, Bradley Lawson Consulting, and something called Heritage Management Solutions. Shell companies, James explained, each one designed to obscure the source and destination of funds. Classic money laundering structure. The first suspicious activity began 14 months ago. Brad had somehow gained access to my business banking information and had been tracking our cash flow, apparently looking for signs of weakness. He was monitoring your company's financial health before you were, James said grimly. These bank records show he was pulling reports monthly, sometimes weekly. How? I'd never given him access to company accounts beyond his project management authority. The answer was as simple as it was betraying. Jennifer, his wife, worked part-time bookkeeping for 3 small businesses. One of them used the same accounting software as Lawson Construction. She'd used her legitimate access credentials to hack into our system. Digital breaking and entering, James called it. Federal computer fraud charges if we can prove intent, which these documents clearly show. But the real sophistication was in the timing. Brad had started positioning for the trust theft 6 months before my business actually failed. The forged documents weren't just copies of my signature. They were traced from legitimate documents in my file, then artificially aged using techniques James had only seen in high-level white-collar cases. Someone taught him this, James said. This isn't amateur hour. The paper quality, the ink aging, the notary fraud. This required professional consultation. Who? The answer was in Brad's credit card records, which Elena had subpoenaed as part of the trust investigation. Marcus Chen and Associates, a disbarred attorney who specialized in asset protection for clients facing legal troubles. Brad had paid them $15,000 in consulting fees spread across 6 months, all charged to something called business consulting. Chen was disbarred for exactly this kind of scheme, Elena noted. He's been running a quasi-legal practice, helping people manipulate family trusts and estate planning documents. The state attorney general has been building a case against him for 3 years. So Brad wasn't just a thief. He was a thief with professional training. But James had found something even more disturbing in the offshore account records. The $1.2 million Brad had stolen from Sophie's trust wasn't just sitting in the Cayman Islands. It had been immediately reinvested in something called cryptocurrency mining equipment and high-risk currency speculation. He wasn't planning to hide the money, James explained. He was planning to multiply it, then bring it back into the U.S. financial system as legitimate business income through his LLCs. If the investments had paid off, Brad could have returned Sophie's trust money and claimed he'd been managing it aggressively for better returns. If they failed, which they had, losing $340,000 in the past month alone, he could claim market volatility and legal confusion over trustee authority. Either way, he'd have a legal cover for the initial theft. The basement rental made perfect sense in this context. At $250,000 annually, it would generate enough income to cover the trust losses, while establishing my dependency for the eventual conservatorship petition. Your son sees you as a long-term revenue stream, James concluded. Milk the assets while you're dependent, then take control of everything through legal guardianship when you can't fight back. But the most chilling discovery was in Brad's personal communications, which Elena had obtained through the criminal complaint process. Text messages with Jennifer revealed discussions about accelerating Dad's decline and managing the timeline. They'd even researched adult assisted living facilities with memory care units. They're planning to have you declared incompetent, Elena said quietly. The basement arrangement, the financial dependency, the social isolation, it's all documentation for a mental competency challenge. The plan was diabolical in its thoroughness. First, establish my dependency through the rental arrangement. Second, document my poor financial decisions, like paying $250,000 for basement housing. Third, isolate me from family and friends to prevent outside intervention. Fourth, file for emergency conservatorship citing mental decline and financial irresponsibility. Once they had legal control, everything would become theirs to manage. My remaining assets, my medical decisions, my living arrangements. I'd become a ward of the state with my son as guardian. Except Brad had made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed I was actually helpless. James, how long would it take to document all of this for law enforcement? For local police? Too complex. They'd refer it to federal authorities anyway. For the FBI, I could have a complete presentation ready in 48 hours. Wire fraud, money laundering, computer fraud, elder abuse. This hits multiple federal statutes. Do it. Elena, I want you to contact the FBI field office. I'm ready to file formal complaints on all charges. Chuck, once we do this, there's no going back. Brad will be arrested probably within the week. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Sophie crying at the window as I moved into the basement. I thought about the 18 months of careful manipulation and theft. I thought about the assisted living facilities with memory care units. But Brad was planning something worse than theft. The FBI's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Agent Sarah Collins, a 20-year veteran of white-collar crime investigations, would wire me up for a conversation designed to get Brad to confess to his crimes on the record. The beauty of financial criminals, Agent Collins explained as technicians fitted the recording equipment under my shirt, is that they love to explain how clever they've been, especially to someone they think can't hurt them anymore. The wire was smaller than I'd expected, a device no bigger than a smartphone battery, positioned between my shoulder blades, where Brad was unlikely to notice it. The microphone was built into a pen that looked identical to dozens of others I'd carried over the years. Your job is simple, Collins continued. Act like you're suspicious but not certain. Ask questions that let him explain himself. Let his ego do the work. We'd chosen April 18th for the confrontation. Brad had texted me that morning about rent status for next month, his usual monthly reminder that I was just a tenant in his eyes. Instead of texting back, I climbed the stairs from the basement and knocked on his front door. Through the window, I could see him watching television while Jennifer prepared dinner. Sophie was at the kitchen table working on homework. Normal family life, except the patriarch was living in the basement, wired for federal recording equipment. Brad opened the door wearing the expression I'd grown to hate. That patient, patronizing smile he reserved for dealing with problems. Dad, what's up? You could have just texted about the rent. I think we need to talk, Brad, about more than just rent. Something flickered in his eyes. Wariness, maybe concern. Okay, sure, let's go to my office. His home office was a converted bedroom overlooking the backyard, where I'd taught him to throw a baseball 25 years earlier. The walls were covered with his business degree, real estate licenses, and a photo of us breaking ground on his first construction project in 2015. Better times, when I still thought I was raising a son instead of creating a predator. Brad closed the door and gestured to a chair across from his desk. The power dynamic was carefully orchestrated. Him behind the desk in the authority position, me in the supplicant's chair. What's on your mind, Dad? I pulled out the pen, clicked it open, and set it on the desk between us. I've been thinking about Sophie's college fund, the trust we set up for her. His face went blank in a way that confirmed everything James Murphy had discovered. What about it? Well, Elena Rodriguez called me last week, said there might be some irregularities with the trustee documentation. I figured you might know something about it, since you're always asking about family finances. Brad leaned back in his chair, and I could see him calculating. How much did I know? How much was Elena willing to tell me? What were his legal exposures? Dad, trust law is complicated. Sometimes paperwork needs to be updated for tax purposes or regulatory compliance. Elena probably just wanted to make sure everything was current. That's interesting because she said someone had submitted amendment papers to make you the trustee. Papers with my signature on them. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Brad's fingers drummed on his desk, a nervous habit from childhood that he'd never outgrown. Dad, you're getting older. Sometimes people forget things they've signed. It's perfectly normal. Getting older. The opening move in the competency challenge. Brad, I'd remember signing papers to give you control of Sophie's money, especially $2.8 million worth. $2.8 million? His voice pitched higher. Dad, that trust isn't worth nearly that much. You must be confused about the amounts. Interesting. He was lying about the trust value, which meant he knew exactly how much was in it. Elena showed me the statements, Brad. $2.8 million of January. But apparently there have been some withdrawals recently. Large ones. I could see sweat beading on his forehead now. Dad, if Elena has concerns about trust management, maybe we should all meet together, get everything clarified. That's a good idea. We should also clarify how you were able to access the account to make wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Brad's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, defiance, and finally something that looked like resignation. Dad, you don't understand the complexity of modern asset management. Sometimes money needs to be moved quickly to take advantage of investment opportunities. Investment opportunities? You stole Sophie's college money to gamble on cryptocurrency. I didn't steal anything. The words exploded out of him. That money was going to sit in some conservative portfolio, earning nothing while inflation ate it alive. I was trying to grow it for her future. There it was. Confession to accessing the trust funds, confirmation of the cryptocurrency investments, and a motive that would play terribly with a jury. But I wasn't done yet. Brad, how exactly did you become trustee? Because I never signed any papers making you trustee. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, colder, more calculated. Dad, you've been under a lot of stress lately. The business failure, losing the house, having to depend on family for housing. Sometimes stress affects memory and judgment. Maybe you signed papers and just don't remember. The competency narrative, delivered with clinical precision. Are you saying I'm losing my mind? I'm saying you need help, professional help. Maybe it's time to consider having someone else manage your affairs. Someone who understands finance and legal requirements. Someone like you? Someone like me. I reached for my pen and clicked it twice. The signal for Agent Collins that I'd gotten enough. Brad, there's something I need to tell you. That's when he said the words that would put him in prison. There's nothing to tell, Dad. You're going to sign the papers. I need you to sign. You're going to live where I tell you to live, and you're going to be grateful for the help. The mask was completely off now. This wasn't my son speaking. This was a predator who'd been playing a long con for 18 months. And if I don't? Brad stood up from behind his desk, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the room. Dad, let me explain reality to you. You have no business, no house, no income, and no options. You're living in my basement because I allow it. You're staying in my family's life because I permit it. I remain seated, keeping my voice level despite the fury building in my chest. That sounds like a threat, Brad. It's not a threat, it's a fact. You're financially dependent on me, and that dependency gives me certain rights. Legal rights. Legal rights to what? To protect my family from poor decisions. To ensure that remaining family assets are properly managed. To prevent any further financial disasters, like the one that cost us loss in construction. Cost us? He was already claiming ownership of my life's work in his narrative. I never asked you to protect me from anything. You don't have to ask. It's called involuntary conservatorship, Dad. When an elderly person demonstrates inability to manage their affairs, family members can petition the court for legal guardianship. There it was, out in the open, the end game of 18 months of manipulation. Based on what evidence? Brad smiled, and it was the coldest expression I'd ever seen on my child's face. Based on paying $250,000 annually to live in a basement. Based on making poor business decisions that cost dozens of people their jobs. Based on the testimony of family members concerned about your declining mental state. What family members? Jennifer and I have been documenting your behavior for months, Dad. The paranoid accusations about money management. The inability to accept reasonable help. The social withdrawal and isolation. Social withdrawal. I was isolated because they'd isolated me. And Sophie? What does she think about Grandpa's declining mental state? Something flickered in his eyes at the mention of his daughter. Sophie loves you, Dad, but she's 8 years old. She doesn't understand adult situations. When the time comes, she'll understand that we did what was necessary to take care of you. When the time comes for what? For you to get the professional care you need. There are excellent facilities that specialize in elderly patients with cognitive decline. 24-hour monitoring, medical supervision, structured activities. He was describing a nursing home with all the clinical detachment of someone discussing a business transaction. You want to have me committed. I want to ensure you receive appropriate care while protecting the interests of this family, including Sophie's interests. Sophie's interests? You stole her college fund? I invested Sophie's money more aggressively than your conservative approach would have allowed. Yes, there were some losses, but long-term growth requires accepting short-term volatility. The sociopathic audacity was breathtaking. He'd stolen $1.2 million, lost a third of it gambling on cryptocurrency, and was characterizing it as sophisticated portfolio management. Brad, what you did was theft, wire fraud, money laundering. What I did was asset management with proper documentation and legal authority as designated trustee. You forged my signature. I executed documents consistent with your stated intentions regarding family wealth management. Every sentence was carefully constructed to avoid direct admission of guilt while maintaining the narrative of legitimate authority. Someone had coached him well. My stated intentions never included giving you control of Sophie's money. Your stated intentions have become increasingly unclear as your mental state has declined. That's exactly why conservatorship proceedings exist. To protect vulnerable elderly individuals from their own poor judgment. I looked at my son, the stranger wearing my child's face, and realized he'd moved beyond theft into something far more dangerous. He wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing my autonomy, my freedom, my very identity as a competent adult. And once he had legal guardianship, there would be no coming back. What happens to me after you get conservatorship? You'll be taken care of. Properly supervised medical care, safe housing, regular meals, structured social interaction, everything you need. And my money will be managed responsibly by someone qualified to handle complex financial decisions. Someone like you, someone like me. The recording device between my shoulder blades felt warm against my back. Agent Collins and her team were hearing every word of this through their surveillance van parked 3 blocks away. But Brad wasn't finished. Dad, there's something else we need to discuss. Your current living arrangement. The basement? It's not working out. Jennifer is concerned about having you so close to Sophie. Given your increasing confusion and agitation, we think it's better for everyone if you transition to a more appropriate setting. You're evicting me. I'm suggesting you consider residential care options. There's a very nice place called Sunset Manor, about 40 minutes from here. Memory care wing, beautiful grounds, professional staff. Is Sunset Manor? I'd driven past it once while visiting a client. Institutional brick buildings surrounded by parking lots. The kind of place where elderly people went to disappear. And if I refuse? Dad, you don't really have the option to refuse anymore. Your tenancy here was always temporary and conditional. The condition was demonstrating stability and good judgment. Recent events suggest that's not possible. Recent events, like questioning his theft of Sophie's trust fund. I prefer to think of it as accepting help versus requiring intervention. My son was holding me hostage using the legal system as his weapon. But as I sat there listening to him describe my future imprisonment with clinical detachment, I realized something that chilled me more than the threat itself. This wasn't the heat of the moment reaction of someone caught stealing. This was the execution of a carefully planned strategy. Brad had thought through every angle, every contingency, every form of resistance I might offer. He'd been planning this conversation for months, which meant he'd been planning to destroy my freedom and autonomy since before he'd even stolen Sophie's money. I had 24 hours before everything I'd worked to preserve would disappear forever. That night, I sat in my basement apartment reviewing everything Agent Collins had explained about federal wire recording procedures. The conversation with Brad had been recorded legally, but to build an airtight case, they needed him to confess to specific crimes with explicit detail. The conservatorship threat changed the timeline. If Brad filed emergency guardianship papers claiming I was a danger to myself or others, I could be in a locked facility within 72 hours while the legal process played out. Even if I eventually won, the damage to my reputation and independence would be irreversible. Agent Collins called at 11 p.m. Chuck, we've reviewed the recording. Brad definitely confessed to accessing the trust funds and making investment decisions without proper authority. But he was careful not to admit to forgery or criminal intent. A good defense attorney could argue everything was done in good faith based on mistaken legal authority. What do you need for stronger charges? Clear admission of forged signatures, acknowledgement of theft rather than investment, or evidence of broader criminal intent. Ideally, all three. I thought about the text messages James Murphy had found discussing accelerating Dad's decline and managing the timeline. Brad was more dangerous than a thief. He was a predator who saw family members as assets to be exploited. Agent Collins, what if I told you I have information about a more serious threat? Something that would give you leverage to make Brad talk. What kind of information? I told her about the conservatorship plan, the Sunset Manor facility, the systematic isolation and gaslighting. As I spoke, I could hear her typing notes. Chuck, what you're describing is elder abuse under federal statute. If we can prove deliberate psychological manipulation designed to facilitate financial exploitation, that's a 20-year felony. How do we prove deliberate manipulation? We get him to admit it, on recording, and I think I know exactly how. Her plan was brilliant in its psychological precision. The next morning, I would call Brad and tell him I'd thought about our conversation and was ready to accept help with my affairs. But first, I needed to understand exactly what he'd done with Sophie's money so I could explain it to Elena Rodriguez when signing the new trustee papers. The psychology was perfect. Brad's narcissism wouldn't let him resist explaining how clever he'd been. His paranoia about legal exposure would make him want to control the narrative by getting ahead of any investigation. and his need to maintain dominance would require proving that every decision had been justified. We'll have a full surveillance team in position, Collins explained. Audio, video, and agents positioned around the property in case things go wrong. What do you mean, in case things go wrong? Chuck, your son has demonstrated systematic predatory behavior over 18 months. He's stolen money, forged documents, planned to have you committed against your will, and threatened your freedom if you resist. People who plan that methodically sometimes have contingencies we haven't anticipated. Contingencies. The word hung in the air like a warning. At 6 a.m., Collins and 2 other agents arrived at a coffee shop 12 blocks from Brad's house to wire me up for what she called the endgame recording. This time, we're using military-grade equipment, she explained as technicians fitted multiple microphones and a GPS tracker to my clothing. Video feed from a button camera, audio from 3 different sources, and real-time location monitoring. You're expecting trouble? We're preparing for any possibility. Chuck, your son has invested 18 months and significant money in a scheme that's about to collapse. Desperate people make dangerous decisions. As we drove toward Brad's house, Collins briefed me on the specific confessions they needed. Admission of forgery, confirmation of cryptocurrency gambling with Sophie's money, acknowledgement that the basement rental was designed to establish dependency, and details about the conservatorship timeline. If he gives us all 4, we can hold him without bail pending trial. I thought about Sophie, probably getting ready for school right now, about the tears on her face when I moved into the basement, about the college fund her father had gambled away while planning to have her grandfather declared mentally incompetent. Agent Collins, my son has become someone I don't recognize, someone dangerous, but he's still Sophie's father. Chuck, the best thing you can do for Sophie is make sure her father faces consequences for his crimes. Children don't benefit from learning that family members can exploit each other without accountability. The next morning, Brad walked right into the trap we'd prepared. Brad answered his door at 9 a.m. wearing a business suit and the confident smile of someone who thought he'd won. Dad, you sounded different on the phone last night, more reasonable. I've been thinking about what you said, Brad, about accepting help, about professional care. He gestured me toward the living room instead of his office this time. A subtle power play that positioned him as the gracious host rather than the authority figure. Jennifer had left for work, and Sophie was at school. No witnesses to complicate the conversation. Perfect conditions for what Agent Collins called criminal confession in a controlled environment. I'm glad you're being realistic about the situation, Brad said, settling into his leather armchair while I took the couch. It shows you're still capable of good judgment when you focus. The condescension was automatic now, as natural as breathing. Before I sign any papers, I need to understand what happened with Sophie's money. Elena is asking specific questions, and I don't want to look foolish. Brad's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of calculation before the practiced patience returned. Dad, I've explained this. Sophie's trust needed more aggressive management to keep pace with inflation and education costs. Conservative investments weren't sufficient. But Elena said there were wire transfers to offshore accounts. Offshore investing is standard practice for portfolio diversification. The Cayman Islands have excellent financial privacy laws and tax advantages. He was still using euphemisms, still maintaining the fiction of legitimate investment strategy. Brad, I need you to be specific. What exactly did you do with Sophie's money? A pause. He was weighing how much truth was necessary to maintain control. I moved approximately $1.2 million from the conservative portfolio Elena had established into higher-yield cryptocurrency investments and currency speculation. The potential returns were significantly better than the 3% annually she was getting. And how did you get authority to make those moves? I used the amended trustee documentation that gave me investment authority. The documentation I supposedly signed? The documentation you signed, Dad. You may not remember signing it, but that's exactly why it was necessary. Your memory issues make it difficult for you to track financial decisions. I could hear Agent Collins in my earpiece. Push on the signature issue. Get him to admit forgery. Brad, I never signed papers making you trustee. Elena showed me my signature on those documents, and it wasn't my handwriting. The room went quiet, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the same clock that had chimed through my childhood visits to this house when it belonged to my parents. When Brad spoke again, his voice had changed, colder, more calculating. Dad, your signature has been inconsistent for months. Hand tremors, possibly early-stage neurological issues. The documents I submitted were signed by you during one of our meetings last fall, but I understand why you might not remember. Which meeting? Where? When exactly did I supposedly sign papers worth $2.8 million? October 15th, my office. You were reviewing the quarterly trust statements and agreed that more aggressive management was necessary. Specific date, specific location, specific context. Either Brad was an excellent liar, or he had actually convinced himself that his fantasy version of events was real. But Agent Collins wanted more. Brad, what about the cryptocurrency investments? Elena said there were significant losses. His face hardened. Short-term volatility is normal in emerging markets. The fundamental technology is sound. But how much was lost? Approximately $340,000, but that's temporary. Market recovery will restore those values within 18 months. $340,000 of Sophie's college money, $340,000 of temporary market adjustment on Sophie's diversified investment portfolio. The clinical detachment was chilling. He was talking about gambling away his daughter's future with the emotional engagement of someone discussing stock quotes. And if the market doesn't recover, it will recover. But even if it doesn't, the trust arrangement was always temporary. Once I have proper legal authority through conservatorship, these issues become moot. Because you'll control all the money anyway? Because I'll be able to make rational financial decisions without having to navigate your confusion and Elena's conservative investment philosophy. There it was. Admission that the conservatorship was about gaining control of money, not providing care. Agent Collins in my ear, ask about the timeline, get him to admit the rental arrangement was designed to establish dependency. Brad, how long have you been planning the conservatorship petition? I've been concerned about your mental state for months. The business failure, the irrational financial decisions, the inability to accept help. The basement rental was designed to give you stable housing while documenting your need for assistance. Documenting my need for assistance? Paying $250,000 annually for basement housing demonstrates exactly the kind of poor judgment that supports a competency challenge. The sociopathic brilliance was breathtaking. He'd created the evidence of my incompetence by exploiting my desperation, then planned to use that evidence to justify taking control of my life. But I still needed the final piece. What happens if I refuse to go along with the conservatorship? Brad stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. When he turned around, his expression was completely cold. Dad, you don't have the option to refuse anymore. That's when he said the words that would destroy him completely. You see, Dad, everything that's happened over the past 18 months was necessary. Your business didn't just fail, I helped it fail. Your isolation didn't just happen, I orchestrated it. And your dependency on me isn't accidental, it's exactly what I designed. My blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? The late payments from clients that killed your cash flow? I advised them to delay payments until your company looked financially unstable. The credit line the bank pulled, I provided them with information about your declining competency during their review process. The subcontractors who suddenly canceled, I told them you were becoming unreliable. I stared at my son, the stranger who had systematically destroyed everything I'd built. You sabotaged my company? I accelerated its inevitable collapse while positioning myself to preserve family assets. Your attachment to that business was sentimental and financially irrational. You were never going to retire voluntarily, never going to transfer control, never going to admit you needed help. So you destroyed it. I liberated the family from your inability to make necessary changes. The clinical language couldn't disguise the magnitude of what he was confessing. 47 years of work, dozens of employees' livelihoods, my entire professional identity, deliberately destroyed by someone who called it liberation. And the house foreclosure? Once I controlled your business banking information through Jennifer's access, documenting your financial distress was simple. The bank needed evidence of default risk. I provided documentation of erratic decision-making and declining business judgment. You fed them information to justify foreclosure? I provided accurate information about your compromised mental state and deteriorating business management capabilities. My mental state was compromised because you were systematically destroying my life. Your mental state was compromised because you're 62 years old and couldn't accept that you needed younger, more capable management of family affairs. Brad walked back to his chair and sat down with the calm satisfaction of someone explaining a successful business strategy. The basement rental wasn't just about money, Dad. It was about establishing legal precedent for dependency while documenting your poor judgment. What rational person pays $250,000 to live in a basement? Only someone whose cognitive abilities are severely impaired. You created the circumstances that made it necessary. I created circumstances that revealed your true limitations while protecting family assets from your increasingly erratic decisions. The sociopathic logic was flawless in its cruelty. Destroy someone's options, then point to their desperation as evidence of incompetence. Brad, what about Sophie? What about your daughter's college money that you gambled away? Sophie's money was never at risk. The cryptocurrency investments were funded through secured loans against my business equity. If the investments failed, only my assets were at risk. But you transferred $1.2 million from her trust account. I transferred money that belonged to the family into investments that would benefit the family. Once I have legal guardianship, these accounting details become irrelevant. Because you'll control everything. Because I'll be able to manage everything efficiently without having to navigate your resistance or Elena's legal obstacles. Brad leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who'd solved a complex problem through careful planning. Dad, you should be grateful. In 18 months, I've preserved more family wealth than you managed to do in 47 years. Your sentimental attachment to that construction company would have destroyed everything eventually. I simply accelerated the timeline while protecting our real assets. Our assets. In his mind, he already owned everything. The conservatorship is just paperwork at this point, he continued. You'll be well cared for, your assets will be professionally managed, and Sophie will have a secure future without depending on your increasingly questionable judgment. But he still didn't know the most important thing. Everything had been a test, and he had failed completely. Brad, I said quietly, there's something I need to tell you about the past 18 months. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a legal document Elena had prepared for this moment. This is the Delaware Trust Establishment Certificate, filed April 15th, 2021, 2 years before your first attempt to access Sophie's money, 2 years before my business failed, 2 years before I became the desperate old man living in your basement. Brad's face went white as I continued. $8.5 million in assets, completely protected from creditors, business failures, and family members with questionable judgment. The business collapse you're so proud of orchestrating, it freed up additional capital that I transferred to Delaware before filing bankruptcy. That's impossible. Elena would have told me. Elena works for me, not for the trust. The trust has its own legal team in Delaware. Everything you've done for 18 months, the sabotage, the theft, the manipulation, it's all been recorded, documented, and preserved for exactly this conversation. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the backyard where I'd once taught this predator to throw a baseball. You see, Brad, everything that's happened was indeed a test, just not the test you thought you were conducting. The sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway interrupted my explanation. Through the window, I could see Agent Collins and 6 other federal agents stepping out of 3 unmarked cars. I needed to know if my son was someone who would help his father in genuine distress, or someone who would see opportunity in that distress. I needed to know if the business I built was going to someone with integrity, or someone who would exploit family trust for personal gain. The front door chimed as agents took positions around the house. You failed that test completely, Brad, but you provided something valuable in the process. Complete documentation of your criminal mind and sociopathic character. Agent Collins appeared in the doorway with 2 other agents. Bradley Lawson, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, elder financial abuse, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. As they read him his rights, Brad looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Genuine fear mixed with absolute incomprehension. How, he whispered, 47 years in business teaches you to plan for every contingency, son, including the possibility that your own child might be your worst enemy. 6 months later, Sophie started 3rd grade with her college fund fully restored and growing in a legitimate trust managed by professionals who understand that family wealth means family protection, not family exploitation. Trust is earned through character, not inherited through blood. If you have children, let me know in the comments. One value you want to pass down to them. Not money, principles.